On the heels of the long-expected change of our councils of government into county-level equivalents, it's important that their leadership understand the ins and outs of municipal governance. Perhaps there is no better example than Matt Hart, who has recently taken the helm at the Capital Region Council of Governments. A longtime town manager, he will guide the COG into a new era of regional programs and cooperation. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Gateway and Housatonic Community Colleges. The Municipal Voice of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state and local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt. Glad to be here.
So you've taken charge of a council of government, or COG, at a really interesting time for them in Connecticut. Starting this year, COGs will be formally given county-level equivalents. What is the impact of this designation?
Oh, great question, Matt. So as you said, the federal government, the U.S. Census Bureau, has recently approved a county-level designation for Connecticut's 9 councils of governments. And that means that for census purposes, the Bureau, all of its major reports, now will provide that data consistent with the 9 councils of governments, those planning regions, as opposed to the 8 counties, which we still have in name only, but have not had any formal governmental authority since 1959, 1960.
Excellent. So COGs have been around for a little while now, and they're not, they do a lot of things, but this change has certainly given a little bit more weight in state business for the COGs. How do you look at this extra weight it is giving to the COGs in Connecticut when you're advocating for things, for the region, the state, to the state and federal governments?
I think it's certainly helpful just in terms of advancing our mission and our key priorities.
Yeah.
For example, the state has wisely determined, in my opinion, that COGS will play a key role in helping to administer the application process for discretionary funding for the federal bipartisan infrastructure law funding, the IIJA, that the state will be receiving, a little over $6 billion over a 5-year period. And COGS will be charged with helping their member towns prepare those applications and vet them as well before they're submitted to the state for review and hopefully approval.
That's great. And that can mean a lot of money for your town, certainly.
Yes, very much so.
So that's kind of one thing that you're doing, but there are lots and lots of things that COGs do. What would you say are some of the more important things that your organization does for towns and cities?
Yeah, the way I like to describe it is talk about the 3 primary hats that we're wearing. So CROG, the Capital Region Council of Governments, we serve 38 municipalities in the greater Hartford region. We support a population of a little under 1 million people. We cover an area of about 1,000 square miles. So the first primary hat we wear is that of a council of governments. And in that, I like to think about our municipal services portfolio, the services we provide directly to our towns, such as our purchasing coalition, where we do the competitive bidding on behalf of our members, and they can purchase commodities or services off of our list. So that Council of Governments hat, another thing we do under that is prepare our annual legislative agenda. That's another good example of our work as a COG. Second major function I like to talk about is that of a regional planning agency. So CROG, like the other COGs, we have a Regional Planning Commission that is responsible for administering our regional plan of conservation development. I think we all know that our municipalities, our cities and towns have their own POCDs. The state has its own plan and the regions have a plan. So we vet applications for consistency with our regional plan. And then the third hat I like to talk about is that of a MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization. That is a federal designation, and in that role, we administer federal transportation dollars under our Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. And in any given year, CROG is administering roughly $40 million in transportation funding. That's a combination of federal and state dollars. So those are kind of the three main hats that we wear.
Very interesting. So as you said, the capital region compromises 38 municipalities, which goes from, big city, Hartford and such, all the way down to small towns. How do you kind of balance the interests of the big cities and the small towns in what you do?
Excellent question, Matt, because you're right. In CROG alone, we cover a very broad and diverse spectrum, which we're very proud of. But we've got our small rural towns, certainly by Connecticut standards. Most of our members I would classify as suburban, and then we have a handful of urban municipalities as well. Our city of Hartford and New Britain and East Hartford to some extent. So, there's certainly some commonality across the region. All the towns, regardless of their size, are facing budgetary pressures, having trouble finding, recruiting talented and experienced staff. I think it's trying to find areas of commonality. We work to do that across all 38 towns, and there are some. But then also recognizing that some of our services, some of our programs, some of our initiatives may be, more responsive to or more attractive to a smaller cross section of the membership. So like CCM, we're always looking to balance that out, making sure that we're responsible to all of our members, but understanding that some of our programs and services on an individual level are going to be more attractive to different towns.
Yeah, definitely a balancing act that we are familiar with at CCM.
Yes.
Moving on to something a little bit different. You posted local safety plans on your Facebook recently with some kind of harrowing statistics. Between 2016 and 2018, about 50% of the fatal and serious car crashes in Connecticut happened on municipally owned and maintained roadways. What can a COG do with this information, and how can you kind of foster change?
That is a very concerning trend. I think we're all aware of the dangers and impacts of distracted driving, reckless driving, what have you. So it is important to measure that and to calculate and maintain the statistics, which is an important functions that COGs do in their role as the MPO, for example. But another thing we can do that I think is even more tangible is COGs play a major role, again, with that MPO hat, in terms of we conduct studies. We hire experts to identify and study problematic intersections and other areas where you have fatalities, high numbers of crashes, etc. We conduct those studies, we conduct the analysis, and we recommend a set of improvements. And then those studies can then form the basis of a project to implement those improvements. So that's a very, very important role we play in that area.
And those projects you mentioned, is that something that like one of your members might bring to you and say, hey, could you look into this? Like we have this one intersection that's got this history of being really bad. Could you take a look at it? Or how do you identify those projects?
It's both. Much of it is member driven. We'll conduct a corridor study. Recent examples would include looking at the major transportation corridors in Hartford and East Hartford. We've also conducted a recent project in East Windsor. We've got one going on right now in Enfield, also in the eastern part of our region, heading out into to Mansfield stores. So, that's a very beneficial role that we play on behalf of our members, bringing that expertise to the table.
Yeah. In a local road safety plan, there's 6 stages: establish leadership, analyze data, determine emphasis areas, identify strategies, prioritize and incorporate strategies, and then evaluate and update. Can you kind of take us through how a project might kind of evolve over time?
Well, certainly. So as I said, the ideas come from, our members as well as the CROG staff. looking at the data, following the trends, etc.
Yeah.
So we have a transportation committee that is comprised of a cross-section of our membership. And it's been chaired for a long time, very ably so, by John Coleman from Bloomfield. And they will analyze these things and determine when a study is warranted.
Okay.
So we'll put together a draft scope and then seek appropriate funding, either at the federal level or the state level, seek committee approval to submit the application. The appropriate state or federal agencies, such as the Federal Highway Administration, they'll review and vet the application. They may have some suggested amendments or tweaks to it. Once a project is approved, we will then, through a competitive bidding process, select a consulting firm who can complete the project working in conjunction with CROG staff.
Yeah.
And at various stages, based on the scope of the project, the scope of work, we'll report back on our status to the Transportation Committee. And there's also always a stakeholder engagement component to the work as well. So then once we have a final draft of a completed study, there's another round of public engagement and a presentation to our Transportation Committee. So once a project is completed, we then look for funding opportunities to implement the improvements that have been recommended.
So you don't just set it on a shelf somewhere and forget about it. You're still then continuing to help pursue actually making it happen.
Correct.
It's very cool. So there's been some argument over the future of the highway in and around the area of Hartford. Would the COG assess the federal highway system and ask for input on how best to move forward with projects around 91 and 84? So
the way that's working, at least for this, for Hartford itself, or I-84, I-91, the specific region you mentioned, the DOT recognized the need to analyze it. The city's been talking about the impact for some years now. Congressman Larson has been a leader on this, and others. So the DOT has commissioned the Greater Hartford Mobility Study, which is a multi-year project looking at impacts of the highway and ways to promote public transportation, vehicular safety, how to ensure that commuter traffic can safely continue to get through the region, goods and services, et cetera. So it's a pretty comprehensive study. And I think we should see a draft of that by the end of this calendar year, perhaps early into 2023. And as part of that study, they will look at potential realignments for the major highways in the specific region.
Yeah, and would rail be figured into those plans, or is that a separate thing?
Rail is part of the transit component, rail and bus, as well as micro mobility. What's micro mobility? That's looking at options for cycling, scooters, et cetera, for commuting purposes.
Okay, so it's commuting, but not like the pedestrian bike paths for recreation. Those are kind of two separate things.
Yes, and those are very important. And CROG has long been involved in that. One of our major studies right now is looking at options to close the remaining gaps in the East Coast Greenway. Because we've got a pretty extensive rail trail network here in Connecticut on both sides of the river. And if we can hook it all up, we're going to have close to a couple hundred miles of connected trail, which is really, really neat. Yeah. But those recreational trails, can they serve as commuting options? To a limited extent. I think it's also important to look at how can people, for micro mobility purposes, whether it's bike, scooter, et cetera, how can they best utilize those forms of transportation for aspects of everyday life, whether it's commuting, going to the grocery store, school, et cetera.
Mhm. Does that come in looking at like separate bike lanes on city roads
Yeah,
and
it
those
can,
sort of things?
whole combination of approaches.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
A different kind of infrastructure that's getting a lot of talk in coming months and years is broadband.
Yes.
It's becoming it already is a crucial part of our modern world. What kind of work is the COG doing on connectivity in the capital region?
So, as you may know, that's the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IIJA,
Mhm.
is including some amount of funding to promote accessibility to broadband. And in Connecticut, DEEP, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection,
Mhm.
is taking a lead role for the state.
Okay.
And DEEP actually has a webinar, a virtual meeting, virtual meeting later this week
Okay.
to meet with all the member towns, meet with all the towns, COGs, et cetera,
Mhm.
to talk about opportunities and potential applications to seek that funding or,
Mhm.
or to obtain some of that funding to work on projects in a particular municipality, neighborhood, COG, et cetera.
Mhm.
So I think for the COGs, it's going to be important for us to know where are the gaps.
Mhm.
Where are the gaps either in terms of middle mile or last mile
Mhm.
accessibility to broadband? Where are the gaps in our region? We know to a certain extent, I think the state has a pretty good handle on that. And then I think what we're going to look forward to seeing on how this DEEP process all shakes out.
Mhm.
We're going to look forward to the opportunity to submit applications to seek funding to complete projects for connectivity for our
Mhm.
member towns and within the region.
So one interesting partnership that seems to have been struck that has happened outside of the region is the IGSA, or the Intergovernmental Support Agreement that you've made with the CTDOT and Groton Utilities for the submarine base. Joe Courtney said that this is the kind of collaboration and teamwork that I think is going to really make the state succeed. How do we make sure that these kind of partnerships keep happening?
Well, I think it's important to promote them,
Mhm.
and the nine cogs, we operate in a very collegial and collaborative way. And we're certainly willing to share our respective strengths and talents.
Mhm.
So if CROG is able to step in and provide a service to other parts of the state,
Mhm.
like the sub base in Groton, we're certainly happy to do that. And at the same time, we recognize that if there is another COG, whether it's Northeast Council governments, Southeast Council governments, et cetera, that has a particular strength
Mhm.
that or a program and service that would benefit our members,
Mhm.
we're going to look to promote that as well. So I think continuing to look for those opportunities and to be inclusive in terms of promoting the availability of those programs and services across all nine COGs.
Yeah. And there's some really great opportunities they had there. So with the new kind of county equivalency adding a little bit more weight to some of the stuff you're doing, you see a snowball effect happening in Connecticut. In an interview with your predecessor, Lyle Ray, who served for nearly 2 decades in that position, he said there's a general shift towards regionalism and accepting it in Connecticut. How do you feel about that?
I concur. And first of all, I want to acknowledge Lyle for the tremendous role he played
Mhm.
to promote our region and the state overall. He certainly has been a mentor to me and to several people. So I think another dynamic that's occurring now
Mhm.
that's going to help promote regionalism, perhaps in an indirect way,
Mhm.
is some of the critical workforce shortages that we're facing.
Mhm.
I think we know that state government is experiencing thousands of retirements. The same thing is happening in local government.
Mhm.
Particularly when you look at it in aggregate. And it's becoming increasingly challenging to recruit and retain people, well, primarily to recruit them with the level of training and experience that we're seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And this impacts, jobs across the local government employment spectrum.
Yeah.
And I would highlight building inspectors as one example.
Mm-hmm.
So I think now with such a premium, with such a shortage of candidates, it's all the more important for municipalities to work together and combine resources where feasible.
Yeah.
And here in CROG, for example, the state recently announced a round of regional performance incentive program grants. I want to thank the administration for doing that. We're in the process of putting together 4 applications to look at promoting regional services in animal control, assessment, building inspection, and economic development. And those are just 4 areas where we think if we can create our own offices at the COG level, where we can supplement the services that are being provided by our member towns, especially when they have a vacancy, or maybe they've got an increased workload for some period of time, or even our smaller towns that have long struggled to recruit and retain part-time people. So that's an area, where we think we can step up to meet the evolving needs of our members. And I think towns, there's more pressure on them than ever before, for these reasons to work together.
So it sounds like you have some, ideas of some things you could do that are kind of obvious, sort of no-brainer things where you could help and save the town's money. Are there other projects that you think could be done by the COGs that you might have to push for a little harder, some less obvious projects, but you think could work in the long run?
Well, that's a great question. So let me start off by talking about some things we are presently working on.
Okay.
That maybe in the past we hadn't necessarily see the COGs play a significant role. So one example here in the Capital Region, and it does have statewide impact, is our waste management crisis. Which has been well documented. With MIRA, the Materials Innovation Resource Authority, its waste to energy plant in Hartford is closing by the end of the summer. It did have roughly 50 member municipalities, most of them CROG municipalities. Most of them have since found other options where their residential waste is going to be transported out of Connecticut to landfills in other parts of the country. That's a very expensive solution, and one that is probably only short-term in nature. So CROG, decided, hey, we need to step into that space and come up with a game plan to serve our region for the midterm and the long term. What are we going to do 3 to 5 years from now? More importantly, what are we going to be doing 10 to 15 to 20 years from now? So we have retained our own consultant to work with us. We have formed a steering committee of representatives from our member towns, and we've embarked upon a project to identify a set of short-term and then longer-term solutions to this crisis. And we've reached out to Deep Commissioner Dykes and her staff, her team have been very, very receptive and very, very willing to work collaboratively with us. And we're going to push solutions such as pay as you throw, removing organics from the residential waste stream, potentially extended producer responsibility, EPR, any number of things we're going to be looking at. So that's an example of CROG as a council of governments seeing a regional issue, a state issue, and stepping in to help find solution.
Yeah, something that 10 years ago, when China was taking cheap recyclables, you
Right.
paid money for them, and it was a lot cheaper, it wouldn't have been an issue you might not even thought to have tackled. But your members are now having this problem, and you've had to kind of get on it and look for answers, really.
Yes.
So, kind of a final question, looking towards the future. How will the COG evolve under your leadership? It's clear that the COG's role is increasing, and it has increased over the past 30 years. Where do you see it going? Will we one day is kind of just have counties again, but call them COGs, or where's it going?
Now, I don't know that Connecticut will get to the point, at least not in the near future, where we recreate counties at least in their traditional form. Like, there is a lot that we can do at the Council of Governments level, and I wouldn't rule out county government altogether. I just wouldn't immediately jump to that step. So I think here at CROG, we're going to continue to work to meet the evolving needs of our members. And we spent a fair amount of time talking today about some of the workforce challenges we're facing right now. We're willing to step into that space and work with our member towns, work with state government, work with experts such as our capital workforce partners to identify solutions to that. I can see COGs across the state expanding their municipal services portfolio over the next several years, providing some direct services to their member towns that they haven't in the past, again, to meet those evolving needs and demands. Another important goal for me and for CROG, and I'm sure the other COGs as well, will be leveraging those federal infrastructure dollars. The bipartisan infrastructure law. This is a once in a generation, maybe a once in a career opportunity to do that. So we're gonna work hard to maximize that opportunity. And I think for the COG, it's going to be having the resources on staff and the connections on staff to put together very, very competitive applications on behalf of our region. We're going to be very focused on that over the next 5 years. Thirdly, we're going to continue our work, and this kind of connects very well with the first prong, meeting the evolving needs of our members. But how do we tackle the region's big challenges as well as its opportunities? A challenge would be the waste management crisis I talked about earlier. An opportunity could be, how can we maximize the state and federal government's investment in the Hartford rail line, which we see as extremely beneficial to our region and the greater Springfield area as well. And then lastly, we want to continue our work to promote equity and inclusion and sustainability in our region, thinking about the long term. Yeah.
Well, those all sound like great things. Well, Matt Hart, thank you for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. Sounds like the Capital Region of Council of Governments is in good hands.
Thank you so much. We've got a great team here.
We'd like to thank our guest, Matt Hart. We'd like to thank our sponsors at Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.